3 weeks on from McLaren's bombshell announcement that Daniel Ricciardo will be dropped at the end of the season, despite having a contract for 2023, the 8 times Grand Prix winner is still without a job for next year. But could Ricciardo take a role Lewis Hamilton says he's too good for? That's a question Ricciardo must ask himself as he considers whether to pursue a path usually taken by those at the start of their Formula 1 career and take a reserve driver role. It's hard to imagine someone who has been an F1 star for the past decade being willing to sit on the sidelines, and it's unlikely Ricciardo would see himself doing that. Unless, that is, it's with a team that might just offer him a pathway back to the front of the F1 grid. So who better than Mercedes, the preeminent F1 team of the past decade? Ricciardo has made one thing abundantly clear: he wants to race on in Formula 1. The 33-year-old insists that he still loves Grand Prix racing and ideally wants to have a race seat for 2023. But he's also said he is keeping every option open for next year. That includes the possibility of taking a sabbatical from F1 with a view to a return in 2024 or even a reserve driver role. Indeed, when he said he was keeping every option open, it was in response to a direct question about the possibility of being Mercedes' reserve. One thing Ricciardo doesn't need to be too concerned about is the financial side. McLaren never disputed the fact he had a contract for 2023, so will have agreed to pay him handsomely for not driving one of its cars next year in order to pave the way for new signing Oscar Piastri. We don't know the exact terms of Ricciardo's payout, but it will be substantial. And McLaren CEO Zak Brown has already made it clear that they will not stand in the way of Ricciardo racing in F1 or anywhere else next year. Whether Ricciardo gets a reduced payoff if he takes another F1 role is unclear, but it means that whatever happens, money is not going to be a problem in 2023, so his choice will depend only on what is available and what he thinks is the best option for reviving his flagging F1 career. Whatever happens, he is assured of an income that's in line with his status as one of F1's big names. That means he can afford to take the option that is not only the best for 2023, but that could set him up for 2024 and beyond, regardless of the pay packet on offer. Theoretically, there are 5 seats potentially available for Ricciardo next year across 5 teams. Of those, we can rule out AlphaTauri, which could even have 2 seats available given the willingness to let Pierre Gasly join Alpine, but that is contingent on Colton Herta landing a super licence so he can take up the drive. So a return to Red Bull's junior team isn't on the cards, and likely wouldn't appeal to Ricciardo anyway. Alfa Romeo has not confirmed Valtteri Bottas' teammate, but Zhou Guanyu's continued presence at the team is expected to be announced very shortly. That leaves Alpine, Williams and Haas with vacancies. Ricciardo seems a logical target for Alpine. He's a proven experienced driver and one with a good reputation, even if he has fallen on hard times over the past 2 years. But given he spent 2 seasons with the team on a $25 million a year pay packet, but then opted to join McLaren, the decision appears to be one of never go back on the team side. The possibility can't be dismissed out of hand, but right now it's not going to happen. That means the most competitive available drive seems a no-go. Williams is known to have offered Italian Grand Prix stand-in sensation Nick De Vries a deal, but Ricciardo is a potential alternative. Haas is also keen on Ricciardo, who is, along with Nico Hülkenberg, reckoned to be at the top of its list to replace Mick Schumacher, who also remains in the frame for a 3rd year with the team. But that's dependent on Ricciardo being willing to move to a team that has never won a Grand Prix and relies on its technical partnership with Ferrari for its ability to field cars. It's remarkable that a driver of Ricciardo's reputation and standing should have few possible options, and realistically only with teams in the bottom 3 of the championship. But that's the situation he faces, so the idea he might reject an offer of a race drive with Haas or Williams, if either were forthcoming, is not so absurd. Ricciardo's attitude is not one of Eddie Port in a storm, with a desire to stay on the F1 grid at all costs. Instead, it's all about taking the best option, hence why he could be willing to countenance a non-racing role. So why should Ricciardo consider pushing for the chance to be Mercedes' reserve driver? Well, it would be all about the long game, perhaps bolstered by a desire to see behind the scenes of a team that he's been beaten by constantly throughout his F1 career. It would keep him sharp, with the opportunity to take part in tyre tests and drive the simulator regularly. And there's always the chance that he could be needed to stand in for one of the regular Mercedes drivers should they be unavailable. Plus, given many teams share reserve drivers, Ricciardo could even get the chance to drive elsewhere as a stand-in. But most significantly, while doing that, he will be able to assess a wider range of options for 2024. If he impresses Mercedes internally, that could put him in with a realistic shout of a race drive in 2024 should Lewis Hamilton decide to leave F1 when his contract concludes at the end of next year. That might be a long shot, but Mercedes will be able to benchmark Ricciardo against regular drivers Hamilton and Russell and understand how well he fits into the team. Were Hamilton to decide to retire at the end of next season, that would at least put Ricciardo on the radar for one of the best seats in F1. There's no chance of Mercedes seriously considering Ricciardo given the 2 poor seasons he's endured at McLaren, but the chance to actually drive for the team as reserve could give him that opportunity if he shows that the old Ricciardo speed is still in there somewhere. After all, what's wrong with a long shot? Right now, Ricciardo has no chance of being signed to a race deal by Mercedes or retracting an offer with any front-running F1 team. He might see it as one last, bold roll of the dice in the hope of getting a shot in a potentially title-winning car. You can see why it might appeal more than driving around in the midfield to extend his career and top up his already healthy bank balance while hoping a struggling team's pace dramatically improve. As for Hamilton, he believes Ricciardo would be wasted in a reserve role. Asked about the possibility of Ricciardo joining as reserve, while they were together in the same press conference, he said the Australian should be racing and described him as far too talented to be a third driver. But this all assumes there is a deal on offer, so would Mercedes want Ricciardo? It's a good question, but it could have a vacancy for a reserve given Nick de Vries is set to have a race drive either with Williams or Alpine. Ricciardo would be a very different type of reserve for Mercedes, which has traditionally used younger drivers in the role. There's also the problem that Ricciardo is far too experienced to participate in the mandatory 2 FP1 outings during the season. And while Ricciardo doesn't have the strongest reputation technically, his experience racing at the front means he could have a valuable contribution to make. But if Ricciardo were willing to go for the job, and there has apparently been some contact between the two parties about the possibility, Mercedes would be wise to consider it. At worst, it would get an outstanding reserve driver option with a proven track record of running at the front, but at best, it would have a solution to the question of who to sign if and when Hamilton retires. We don't know whether Ricciardo really wants to take on a role like this, which would involve schlepping around the world to sit on the sidelines on Grand Prix weekends and plenty of time spent at the team's Brackley base without the guaranteed chance to actually race in F1. Ricciardo has stressed that he is willing to be patient and will avoid making an emotional decision, but that in terms of racing, his sole focus is F1 rather than to go elsewhere in motorsport. Pursuing a reserve role with Mercedes would be a calculating move, but while some would dismiss the idea as humiliating, it's well worth Ricciardo considering it if he still harbours ambitions of getting back into a race-winning car, or even, for the first time, into one that can challenge for the championship.